So, session 3, Gillian. I think we'd got to the point where you'd taken over as either in charge or nearly in charge of the American branch of the Financial Times and were setting it up. So I was wondering if you could say anything you like about those years. I think it was about 8 or 9 years you were there.
Yeah, so basically from 2010 I had the role of US Managing Editor in America, which basically meant I was running all of the editorial operations of the Financial Times in America. I actually had a year gap in 2012 when I was out of the country, but otherwise I was there in New York. And that was fascinating because America is a fascinating, complicated, overwhelming, intimidating, exhilarating story at the best of times. But being there as a kind of insider-outsider, in that the Financial Times is headquartered in London, but the US is actually one of our biggest markets for our newspaper. We have an outsized influence in America amongst the coastal political and financial elites. And so we actually, punch above our weights. So we're in the American system, but not of the American system. So being an insider-outsider is very, very exciting. So when I was there, I basically ran a team of journalists in New York and Washington and Chicago, LA, San Francisco, Atlanta for a while, and a few other cities. And we tried to, provide good cutting-edge coverage and newspaper content at a time when the whole media world was shifting very rapidly from print onto digital. So that created a lot of challenges. We as a newspaper were moving from having a very segmented day based around a print publication rhythm into a 24/7 news operation that was constantly rolling online. At a time when, of course, American politics was becoming increasingly febrile. And, fast forward to 2016 and we have the rise of Donald Trump, and suddenly the country is convulsed by these extraordinary political dramas. And so I was basically trying to oversee how we covered it with a front row seat.
So what were the main difficulties in running this organisation and what you faced there?
The difficulties fell into 3 buckets. On the one hand, we found it and find it increasingly hard to compete financially in terms of hanging on to talent and recruiting talent, because one of the big changes that's happened in the last 15 years between the UK and the US, particularly post-Brexit, is that relative salaries have diverged. So it was a challenge basically keeping our reporters and keeping the best reporters. We had incredibly talented journalists, and we still do have incredibly talented journalists, but the days that we could just snap our fingers and get the best in the market, that's changed. Another problem is that the actual media business has changed radically in the last 15 years, in that it's gone from being print to digital, which means that it's 24/7. You're not driven by publishing deadlines. You're dealing with not just text, but also video and audio as well. There is an arms race in terms of big data analysis. So all of our competitors are investing heavily in having extraordinary cutting edge graphics and multimedia offerings and things like that. And so we're trying to integrate all of this into the way that we operate. And the other thing that's very challenging is that as news has gone digital and as social media has exploded, the relationship between a journalist and the reader, or the audience as we now call it, has changed radically. In that in the old days, a journalist would basically, and a newspaper would present the news and they would curate it as they wanted. And it was very much a hierarchical relationship where essentially the newspaper was giving the news to the reader, and the reader for the most part couldn't try and fashion the news themselves or even necessarily comment back or interact. And what digital news has done and social media is create this concept of citizen journalism and flatten the power relationship whereby readers can now pick and mix the news they want to read. So they personalize and customize what they're getting. They can respond very quickly. They can interact with the author. And it's a much more interactive, dynamic process now creating news. So that was the second bucket. And the third bucket of challenges was around the nature of the story. Because when Donald Trump was elected, that changed how the White House started to put out information, in that it wasn't done through staged press conferences anymore. It was done through tweet. It was a very fast-paced story where people didn't know who to contact. People around the world were very interested in that. And so that again changed the dynamics of how we worked quite rapidly, which made it hard as well.
Right. So what were the major rewards? What did you find most satisfying about that period?
Well, being in America is an extraordinary experience. You know, you are dealing with a country that's not only the biggest economy in the world, but believes it is the biggest, most dominant player on the world stage, and also has a concept of American exceptionalism in that they believe that they are special. You can sit there and argue with that concept and say that's rubbish, but it is an extraordinarily self-confident, overpowering country. So trying to understand it is critical for understanding how the world works. And just having a front row ringside seat on both the country and the country in a moment of extreme flux, and the type of tensions and conflicts and self-debate and self-reckoning that was unleashed by Donald Trump was extraordinary.
Well, that overlaps with the next question is, what is your feeling about, what your prognosis? I mean, how America is developing, where it's likely to go in the next few years?
America is deeply troubled in some ways. It has a combination of an incredibly dynamic, powerful private sector and a corporate base that's actually becoming increasingly powerful on the world stage today, rather than less powerful. If you look at metrics about what proportion of global companies and global corporate power are found in different regions right now, America's rising really quite dramatically at the moment. All of the talk about Chinese companies taking over the world has not actually happened when you look at the actual metrics in terms of corporate power. And if you look at financial power, again, it's very striking that the private American companies are getting a bigger and bigger footprint on the world at the moment. And a lot of business has been moving out of Europe and out of London in particular to America, and the capital markets have been becoming more and more dominant. Again, the great surprise of many people is that Chinese capital markets have not been nearly as dominant right now as we had expected. So the private sector in America is on an absolute roll and becoming more and more powerful. And the innovation and the extraordinary drive of the tech companies in particular is quite remarkable. The public sector is a complete disaster, and the public sector is both deeply inefficient, and the political system as well, and the judiciary is all under attack. But the debt level is rising. The ability of the government to tackle the problems to do with the social problems, environmental problems, etc., is increasingly challenged, and the political climate is increasingly poisonous. It is not clear to me whether we are at the high watermark of the polarization and hatred. We may be, actually, surprisingly, because it's very interesting to see how the Democrats have pre-positioned themselves at the moment. But we may not be, and much depends on what's going to happen in the next 3 to 6 months in terms of the political climate. But the question about whether America actually can tackle its structural problems to do with income inequality, education, ability to plan for the future, etc., is very unclear right now. So it is still the dominant power on the world stage, but an increasingly insecure one.
Well, one specific question, you mentioned the debt levels, which are rising, and public debt is 1 trillion every 3 months added to the American debt. The public debt, not the county debts or local level debts. A lot of people talk about de-dollarization. In other words, they can maintain this as long as people buy treasury bonds. But if there is a break away from that, countries refuse to buy the American debt, then the dollar will no longer be the world currency. Do you think that's a likelihood?
Well, there's 3 or 4 things going on here. The first thing to say is that American debt, total debt level at the moment, federal debt or government debt is about $26 trillion, and of that they have to roll over about $9 trillion in the next 12 months. And because the deficit's rising, and because the debt servicing costs have increased significantly, the size of the auctions they're having to arrange to sell this debt are set to expand by about 30% over the next 12 to 18 months. So that's a lot of debt they have to get out and sold, at the moment. You can't necessarily put federal and municipal debt in the same basket, or agency debt, because in fact there is some sign that international buyers are shying away from federal debt and buying more municipal and agency debt. And there is quite a distinction there. This distinction is not as stark as in China, where you have central government debt is very modest, but below the central government tier in China, the debt levels are terrifying right now. And you have this great big split between central and local. In America, it's not quite the same as that, but what you do have is an increasingly challenging debt situation, which at the moment, neither party has indicated they're going to deal with. So at face value at the moment, Harris's plans would add about 2 trillion and Trump's would add about 7 trillion. Now, that is manageable more or less if they manage to keep confidence in the debt markets. The big threat to that at the moment is one, if Trump wins in November, his team have said repeatedly they want to weaken the dollar, which could be quite a blow to confidence. Their plans on paper are very inflationary, and they've indicated they want to undermine the independence of the Federal Reserve. So if you take those 3 things together with the outlook for the debt refinancing needs, you could very well end up with some kind of big crisis over the next 2-3 years. Under Harris, I think it would be less likely to have a full-blown crisis, but it's there as a risk. The problem, though, is in assuming that there's going to be de-dollarization, is that at the moment there is no obvious alternative to the dollar on the world stage, because the euro is not sufficiently well managed, and you do not have sufficiently deep fungible capital markets at the moment, and you don't have enough of a liquidity base to make the euro a viable reserve currency. The Chinese are hobbled by the debt problems at the sub-federal level, and the fact that capital markets are still not sufficiently open and porous for anyone to actually treat it as reserve currency, and nobody trusts either Xi's policy at the moment because it's so opaque, nor do they trust the data which you would need to actually measure debt levels, project economic things and stuff. So the Chinese, yes, the Chinese are doing a good job right now of making their currency used in trade invoicing, but only cross-border trade invoicing. The third-party trade invoicing at the moment is still very, very modest. And the real issue about the dollar is not just the lack of alternatives for reserve currency, it's that the stickiness of trade invoicing around the world, about 80% of cross-border trade invoicing right now is in dollars. The stickiness of that is unlikely to shift quickly. So net, I think probably de-dollarization is not going to happen on a significant basis within our lifetimes. But there could be a crisis, and that would definitely accelerate de-dollarization at the moment.
Right. Okay, so
that's probably far more than you wanted to know.
No, that's very interesting. Coming back, leaving America, so you came to become Provost of King's and started almost a year ago. Tell me why you did that.
Well, I was, first of all, I loved my time at Cambridge. I loved my time in anthropology. always had a sort of hankering to come back into this environment at some point. I was very curious to see how it had developed over time and where both Britain and British academia was going. But the main reason I did it was because, I believe very passionately that Britain doesn't have a lot of jewels in the crown right now that it can boast about on the world stage. And it doesn't have a lot of resources which are completely world-beating. But its intellectual capital is one part of that. And in many ways, its universities are the jewels in its crown. And it frustrates me that there's been so little awareness, appreciation, applause for them, and that they are so often squandered, and that everyone from the government to the wider public isn't out there cheerleading for them every 5 minutes. So, I was kind of curious to see if there was any way I could sort of help simply champion, cheerlead, support what all the amazing work that's been done here. So that was, the other reason coming back.
So, looking back over that year, your first year, this is probably a good time for you to say fairly candidly what the high and low points of what you've discovered became.
Wow. Well, the high points are many. Getting to know the amazing fellows, hearing about their work. I'm like a kid in the candy store in terms of hearing about all the research. Everything from, taking part in Afghan conferences, which I was doing yesterday or the day before yesterday, through to hearing about extraordinary biodiversity projects, spending time with the engineers, doing the quantum computing, talking to people about, all the amazing, there's a variety of stuff that people are studying is extraordinary and just amazing. It doesn't necessarily always hit you in the eye because people are not out there hustling their ideas in a super aggressive way and broadcasting it. You have to dig, but there's an extraordinary kaleidoscope of brilliant minds, brilliant people and brilliant ideas around there. So that's been incredible. Talking to the students has been amazing. I find them really exciting and inspiring. And just realizing that, these are people who are so full of potential, and, sometimes a little nudge or an idea or planting a thought in someone's mind can actually open their eyes to a whole different set of possibilities. So that's great. Living in King's is obviously extraordinary and a real privilege, and spending time in the chapel is one of the things I absolutely love, and just walking or rather jogging around Cambridge is just beautiful. So that's been amazing, and being able to use convening power to bring people together and try to spark conversations and illuminate ideas and things, that's been good. The frustrations have been the very amorphous, unclear nature of the governance structures sometimes. Some of the systems and processes are frankly baffling and peculiar and very irrational, and often I think end up harming the university, not helping, and that's sad. I think there is a naivety sometimes inside the college and the university about how the world is changing and how their place is in the world, and the lack of awareness about what's happening in the wider world and the considerable vulnerabilities is something which I find quite surprising and quite frustrating sometimes. An awful lot of time in the college is, in my view, misallocated, doing things which do not necessarily make sense from a big picture view. So spending 120 man hours debating a fence doesn't seem to me like a very intelligent use of brilliant minds' time and attention. These are people who should be winning Nobel Prizes, not worrying about the shape of the fence. And the financial constraints in the UK is a real challenge.
So when we talked before you started, I set you 3 goals. You asked what you should do, and I said you should do nothing and conspicuously do nothing but do a lot by being here. And I suggested 3 goals, and I wondered how far you'd achieve them. One was to get us a new coffee machine in the fellows' combination room. The second was to get a toilet for the visitors. I can't remember what the third was, but in each case it shows how difficult it is even to do a very small thing in this college.
Yep. I mean, on the coffee machine issue, that is a huge song and a dance, and it's, again, it comes back to the corporate governance issue. I can't wave a magic wand and just get a coffee machine unless I go out and buy it. I had thought about buying it myself, and I would buy it myself. But, again, it's not clear to me people even want a new coffee machine. I mean, you might want a new coffee machine, but whether the majority wants a new coffee machine, it's very hard for me to tell. I have thought about just putting a new coffee machine in there myself and just paying for it and seeing whether anyone uses it or not. And I'm not sure they would, but, we could try that as an experiment. On the toilet issue, I couldn't agree more. It's absolutely beyond insane that we don't have a toilet for visitors. I'm outraged and horrified, and I've made my outrage and horror very, very clear many times. And that is not something that I can wave a magic wand and do either. It's part of the governance structure. And therein lies a tragedy, because, really obvious, intelligent initiatives which could and should make the university dramatically better all the time are constantly blocked by, the governance structure.
Well,
and I'm very happy to do nothing conspicuously. And in fact, I haven't actually done very much in the first year, as far as I'm concerned, other than bring in some speakers into the college, some of which went well, some not so well, get a bunch of students out into international initiatives. And then in the first few weeks, I addressed what were, in my view, 3 immediate reputational risks hanging over the college, which I thought, if we didn't address, could end up causing, a lot of damage. So the only thing I've really done tangibly is put in motion things to address those 3 risks, and then try to do a bit of, PR, intellectual debate, promotion. But I haven't actually done anything else. But, the reactions to even that modest things of what I've done shows me that people, generally speaking, don't want me to do very much, except, be symbolic.
Yeah, I think that's probably true. So I won't ask you what you intend to do over the next.
You can tell me. I mean, I have a very clear idea, but
tell us 1 or 2 things you'd like to do.
Okay. Well, the big slug of what is driven, me coming here is to bring the world to kings and kings to the world. That was a kind of mantra. So that's what I've been trying to do. Some people might think I brought too much of the world to kings, in the form of speakers who they, some of them were liked, some they didn't. But that's been the big picture, and that's very much what I intend to keep doing. If you break it down to more tangible steps, the way I imagine it is, a 4 pillars of what I'm trying to do, based around the letter PR. Essentially, 1, I'm trying to project the college on the world stage and project the fellows' research and all the intellectual riches on the world stage more effectively. Partly to raise money, but also primarily just to get more recognition and respect for what's been done in the college. And doing that both by, talking about it, all over the world, meeting with people, trying to tell journalists about it and things like that. But also, I'm going to be creating a podcast quite soon where I'll basically be interviewing the fellows about their research and then pumping it out that way. So that's going to be a sort of dynamic way of trying to expose this stuff to the wider world. So that's projection. Second part is to promote intellectual exchange inside the college. And that's really about using my convening power to have dinners, discussions, debates, talks, that kind of thing. The third area is trying to proactively connect the students to the wider world in terms of jobs. And Macfarlane, the senior tutor, has got plans to create a futures tutor, which I think is starting this month. We're going to try and tap into the alumni network, and get more internships, more talks, more ways for the students to actually get out into the wider world and use their skills after graduation. And the fourth thing is really about professionalising the operations, not in a way that's going to make them commercial, but it's going to bring them into the 21st century and make them less risk prone. And that's mostly sitting with Ivan, who's doing a great job in Poly, and they are just working through the long, slow, tough battle to take, this whole structure and infrastructure and make it less risk prone for the next 100 years or so. And that's everything from, making sure the buildings don't fall down, to making sure we have a cash flow statement, which we haven't had, a risk register, some kind of grown-up system for managing, all the stuff that Domus Bursa does, etc., etc. And that last part is deeply unglamorous. It's what I call the plumbing. But in my view, if it doesn't happen, the college has condemned itself to becoming a sort of dining society and not much more.
Right. Good luck.
Yeah. So those are the, those are the goals.
They're all doable.
Possibly.
A lot of this footling around for hours discussing very small things and so on. I wondered to what extent your anthropological training helped you endure all that, because, as you know, one of the main themes in the middle part of the last century in anthropology was functionalism, and one of its great contributions was to go to strange societies, find that they were doing apparently bizarre and foolish things, and then see what the function was. They were tying their women's feet or eating each other or whatever it was. And at first sight, it seemed a bit strange and useless. And then Malinowski and co came along and said, well, actually, it has a wider function in a different way that you can. So a lot of what you see is maybe like that. And I was wondering more generally, you found anthropology extraordinarily useful in study and understanding of business organisations, and written very well on the subject. Are there any ways in which you think your anthropological training has helped you understand the rituals, myths and functions of this place?
Absolutely. I mean, it's been an absolute game changer, and it's fascinating, because I use it every single day, and I am mentally treating it like a Japanese community or Tajik village or Tibetan community, things like that. And yeah, the reality is that this place is deeply immersed in a number of rituals and traditions, and has a founding mythology, etc., in a way that's both very self-conscious and very unconscious simultaneously. So as an observer, I find it absolutely fascinating. The challenge for me is keeping both my analytical observational hat on and my leadership hat on, and recognizing that there's all kinds of explanations for what goes on here, many of which are entirely valid and many of which are rooted in the fact that the way that the community has operated in the last 200-300 years is beautiful and astonishing. However, my role here is not just to be an observer and not just to be a carrier of the torch and tradition, but also to see and think about whether it's, fit for purpose in the modern world. And, in some ways it is, but in some ways it isn't, some of the practices. And, I have a choice. I could either just say, okay, fine, I'm going to do absolutely nothing and the college can just swing if it doesn't work out, and etc., or one can say, actually, there are things about the ecosystem and the cultural practices and traditions and rituals which have served it really well in the past 150 years ago, but are not likely to serve it as well in the future. And so how can one mindfully look at those and not necessarily change or replace, but merely add new ideas into the mix? So that's kind of the tension. On the one hand, recognizing the beauty of the cultural traditions here and being part of it, but then also recognizing there may be times when it may not serve best purpose today.
Very good. Changing gear now, I know your particular expertise is in economics rather than politics, but there are a number of events going on in the world, as you know, not American politics alone, but big seismic changes. One of them is the relationship between America and China. And I wondered if, and you know China through Hong Kong and through other forms, and America quite well now, how do you think that relationship is going to work out?
Well, the relationship between US and China is absolutely toxic right now, and is at risk of becoming even more so. And it is without question the single most important relationship on the world stage today. What's been striking in America is a degree to which there has been a bipartisan swing towards increased hostility towards China. And what's equally striking is that, inside China itself, it seems, I say seems because I haven't been there for a few years, but it seems that there's actually a fairly across the board wariness of US intentions as well. And of course that's made worse by the persona of Xi Jinping has significantly changed the dynamic and introduced a newly ideological component into what's happening, or intensified that. And in America, figures like Donald Trump and to a certain degree Biden have really, made hay out of opposition to China being part of their strategy and plank. So the relationship's very troubled in a potentially quite scary way. There are areas of collaboration, quite surprising areas of collaboration, which are emerging from time to time. Subsea cables is one. AI frameworks, surprisingly enough, is another. There are areas of surprising competition. So I'm one person who thought that climate change would be an area of collaboration, and it's turned into an area of geostrategic competition in terms of green technology. But the relationship's very troubled. I happen to believe very strongly with Stephen Roach that what is badly needed right now is the equivalent of a secretariat for US-China relationships that takes place in a third country, not either country, and which provides a dedicated, spoke or air traffic control place for managing that relationship. But that hasn't come forward yet.
Right. Well, moving on from that one to the American-Russian relationship. You're off to Kiev shortly, and you've been following the war there. What are your prognostications and feelings about that?
Russia is fundamentally an imperial power in the way we've not seen in most other major 19th century imperial powers recently. It's unashamedly chauvinist and determined to impose its vision on other countries around it in its orbit. And under Vladimir Putin, it has become not just aggressively imperialist, but also aggressively authoritarian and determined to crush any dissent inside Russia and any free speech and any movement towards the West. So I don't see anytime soon a thawing of relationships between the West and Russia unless Putin is removed or dies. It is possible that if someone like Trump comes in, he will, partly because of German far right and far left, he might try to soften the level of opposition a bit. But actually, what I've actually been made aware of in the last couple of days is that actually people like Mike Pompeo, if Trump were to win, are actually as likely to double down on aggression towards Russia as, not aggression, but basically keeping Russia at arm's length, as the Biden administration or the potential Harris administration. So I don't see any rapid thawing of that at all. Right. And Ukraine, I suspect, will drag on a lot longer.
And what will be the outcome?
Not clear at the moment. I imagine probably at some point it will end up in a frozen conflict, whereby Russia probably hangs on to part of the eastern Ukraine. The rest of the country probably remains intact and probably tries to rebuild itself. My nightmare scenario is a replay of in Chechnya, Grozny, but I do not see a world where the Ukrainians will in any way accept a modus vivendi easily with Russia after what's happened. And I'm also very much in the group of those who believe very strongly that, the battle unfolding in Ukraine is not just about Ukraine. It's a much bigger litmus test for whether we actually believe in values of democracy and agency and freedom, etc., or not.
Right. And then the third, the Middle East, particularly obviously Israel, Gaza, but also the rise of increasing importance of Middle Eastern countries, financially at least, economically. As you know, I was very pleased personally to see a protest camp, a Palestinian supporting protest camp in front of Kings for a long time after it disappeared in London and elsewhere. And if you supported that in some way, then I'm very glad you did. But having laid my cards on the table, what are your feelings about the outcome of that war that's going on there?
The war that's going on is horrific, absolute tragedy. It makes my blood boil, both because of what was done to the Israelis on 7th of October, where lots of, innocents were, killed in horrific circumstances, but also the subsequent torture of the Gaza people, Palestinian people in Gaza, has been absolutely horrific. And my heart bleeds for both sides right now. I am vehemently opposed to Netanyahu's policies and vehemently opposed to the man himself. I'm also opposed to Hamas. And I'm just horrified. I don't believe that any solution is going to work except for a two-state solution. I believe that most people who have spent time in the region and are involved in trying to seek some kind of forward path agree with that. I was with the head of the CIA and the head of SIS yesterday, and that's basically where their heads are and where most diplomats in the region from the West are. And it's also de facto where much of the mood is right now in places like Saudi. But as long as Netanyahu is in power, and as long as Hamas continue to be dominant, I don't have much hope for a sensible solution. It's outrageous that we don't have, proper, people aren't working with the PLA and groups like that right now. To me, the big swing question right now is what the Saudis are going to do. And you have an incredibly ambitious, proactive leader now in Saudi Arabia. And he's significant for three reasons. Firstly, that the time may come when he wants to play a more visibly active role in geopolitics in his backyard and might actually get more involved in trying to create some kind of deal going forward. They've not done that yet, and in fact one of the things that's very striking is a lack of Arab support for the Palestinian people, which again is shameful. Secondly, the Saudi economic plans right now are very striking, and Vision 2030 has the ability to not just generate a lot of growth in the area, but also suck in a lot of capital. And up until now, the Middle East has been a petrodollar recycler, and they've been using their oil dollars to basically cycle back into the US Treasuries market to support it. If Saudi embarks on its Vision 2030 plan with any degrees of serious commitment, it's going to start importing capital into the region, and that's going to change global financial markets quite a bit. But the third issue, of course, is Iran, and the degree to which it is or is not, now a nuclear power, the degree to which it is or is not actively cooperating with Russia and China to present a kind of front against the West, and the degree to which it will or will not, stop its involvement in the region. One immediate casualty of what's happened is Lebanon, which is an absolute tragedy again of what's happened. and that economy is in free fall right now. So it's a complete mess.
And do you see any likelihood in the next few months that the Americans will put real pressure on Netanyahu?
I would love to think so, but I don't see it, because unfortunately fear of Iran is complicating the American position towards Netanyahu right now.
Mm-hmm.
Sadly.
Right.
You know, I mean, the Saudis could play a very useful proactive role right now, but sadly they haven't yet.
So I think
it's hard to escape the conclusion that one of the reasons why October 7th happened was because Israel and Saudi were about to create some kind of peace deal, which the Palestinians wanted to blow up, or that not the Palestinians, but the Hamas wanted to blow up. And that's again another absolutely appalling tragedy, because if there had been some kind of framework for a détente between Saudi Arabia and Israel, we'd be looking at a very different situation now.
I've got through all my questions except one.
We've got loads of time.
But I was wondering if there was anything that you would have liked me to have asked you before I get on to my last one.
No, I'm very happy to talk about anything. I mean, I guess the question you should have asked, I mean, you could ask is, or the point I'd like to stress is that, like everything, the first year I was here, was an extraordinary experience of extraordinarily steep learning curve, absolutely joyous, wondrous, exploration and chance to journey into a whole new, world. I made some mistakes, did some things really well, some things not so well, spent quite a lot of time after the first year thinking about what went well and what didn't, and trying to work out how to course correct for the second year. And I'm a passionate believer that, what, leadership means is being open-minded to possibilities and trying to listen and learn what you can about how to course correct when you need to, while also keeping hold of your true north. So it's been fascinating. I feel extraordinarily lucky to be here. That's one thing I would emphasise.
Well, we've been extraordinarily lucky to have you as well.
I'm not sure everyone would always say that. Anyway.
No, I feel that when people ask me. But I see the best sides of you, no doubt, and I'm not sitting on all those.
Well, I think you see some of the worst as well, but anyway.
Boring committees. So the last thing, which you don't need to say anything about, but you had a lovely wedding recently, so married Henrik, which brings in the question of family. Some people like to say at the end of this interview, I would like to remember my great-grandfather or something, or grandmother, or husband, wife, children. Is there anything you want to say about any of your family?
Wow, gosh. Well, I have had a lot of amazing people in my life through my family. My mother's mother, my maternal grandmother, was a huge impact on me. She was born in an era where she was unable to really ever study at college or travel or have much independence, and spent her whole life deeply frustrated. And so from a very young age implanted in me a desire to get out and use whatever opportunities I might have to travel and be independent, because she hadn't. So she was a great inspiration. I had an extraordinary great aunt who was de facto like a grandmother on my father's side, who had raised my father, who again was single because she was part of the generation for whom all the eligible men were wiped out in World War One. So she basically spent her whole life as a single businesswoman, coming from very, very humble background, and was remarkable and instilled in me this extraordinary belief that you can go out and do things by yourself, even or especially as a single woman. So I'm very lucky to her. So I would say a huge posthumous great thanks to my grandmother Joy, great aunt Ruth, and another woman who also inspired me enormously is an aunt Catherine, who sadly died last year, who again was a very strong woman, not single, but forged a life for herself in Switzerland with a family. So she showed me again what you could do. My own mother was amazing, but came from a family who basically did not encourage her to stay on at school after 16. Very sweet, very kind, very gentle. Spent her whole life basically convinced that she was stupid, and living with very 1950s values, but just wonderfully kind, and would have been absolutely, she died many years ago, would have been beyond shocked to see me in this role, because I think her highest aspiration for me was to be a chalet girl. But she was wonderful, really wonderful. And the great thing about coming from that background with no expectations is that if you ever do anything at all, you're always exceeding other people's expectations, which is good. So those are the people I'd like to say amongst my, forebears, who I'm very grateful to. I am endlessly grateful to my own 2 kids. For many, many years, we were effectively a tight unit who sort of clung together to survive and thrive in often very difficult circumstances. And they are extraordinary, and I would be nothing without them today. When I was a single mum for many years, struggling to keep myself together and the kids together, I would take them with me, and they'd travel with me for years and all that kind of stuff. So they got exposed to the world of work pretty young, but they are flexible and adaptable and amazing. And then last but not least, endlessly grateful to Henrik for coming into my life completely unexpectedly 2.5 years ago, 3 years ago, and showing me that you're never too young or never too old to reboot your life and reinvent yourself.
Well, I remember one last question. If you were, you've anticipated it there, if you were giving advice, you achieve an enormous amount. You are amazing, and I won't ask you again about how you managed to do so much. You are here, there and everywhere and doing all this. But if you were giving advice to young people starting out, maybe in the academic or business world, particularly female, could you give 1 or 2 pieces of guidance?
Goodness, I would say first of all, don't listen to people who want to give you advice, because first of all, recognize there is no template for your professional life. You just have to grab at whatever opportunities come at you with as much joy and passion and enthusiasm. Don't obsess about the destination, just enjoy the journey, because if you don't enjoy the journey, there's no point in doing it. Point 1. We could all get run over by a bus tomorrow. I've nearly died 3 times, and none of us know how long we've got to go. And so you've got to enjoy the journey, point 1. Point 2 is never take no for an answer, never give up. Ask for forgiveness, not permission. Don't be scared of being ambitious. Don't feel you have to apologize for trying to do things. Be willing to fail, be willing to try again. And don't let other people's expectations hold you back. Third thing is that necessity is not just the mother of invention, but inspiration and determination. And if I hadn't had a bunch of things happen to me when I was fairly young in my life, which were pretty, pretty tough to deal with, on some occasions very traumatic, I would not have done anything that I've done in my life for the most part, because much of what I've done has been forced on me because I literally had no choice but to get out there and fight and, find ways to keep moving forward. And last but not least, I'm a passionate believer in karma. And if you give yourself to the world and give yourself to other people and try to sow the seeds of kindness and generosity without any expectation of ever coming back to you, the universe has a way of repaying you in the future. And that is just an incredible, beautiful thing.
As you are.
No, hardly. But I mean that,
Lovely. That was really lovely. Thank you.
Well, that's probably not very helpful.